And I'd like to introduce Cacey Cottrill. She's the restoration biologist that's working a lot on the plants side of the restoration project on Round Island, and she's going to talk to us about saving Round Island's lost grasslands, tortoise analogues for reintroduction success.
Yes. So hello, everyone. I'm Cacey Cottrill. I'm the flora restoration biologist with Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust in the Mauritius Field Program on Round Island. I also work with Roberto, so you might hear a bit of similar things in my presentation. And you may be wondering why, out of all these scientists, the plant biologist is at a tortoise workshop. But you'll find out as I begin my presentation, Saving Round Island's Lost Grasslands, how we're using tortoises in plant restoration. Oh. Okay. For those of you who are not familiar where Mauritius or Round Island is, here's a visual. Mauritius is 900 kilometers east of Madagascar, and Round Island is 20 kilometers northeast of the north coast of Mauritius. Round Island is 219 hectares in size and has been the site of scientific research, restoration, and conservation management efforts for almost 50 years, as it is one of the last remnants of intact native forest in Mauritius. So this might be a bit of a repeat, but Mauritius, unfortunately, is home to many endemic species that have now gone extinct, including 2 giant species of giant tortoises, the domed Mauritius giant tortoise and the saddlebacked Mauritius giant tortoise. As structured restoration efforts began in the early 2000s on Round Island, they looked to find ecological replacements for these species. They chose the Aldabra giant tortoise to start with experiments in 2007, and these were proved to be successful, so they continued to be free roaming in 2008. Since then, monitoring has continued on their impacts and spread on Round Island, as Roberto mentioned, by staff, as well as master's and PhD students, who've all been looking at the original hypothesis that by introducing ecological replacements to Round Island, they would bring back the lost species interactions to help reduce non-native flora and increase native species populations. As this is directly relevant to the work that I do on Round Island, I'm very interested in how tortoises have affected the native plant community, how they've changed it, how they have not changed it, and what is still missing. Roberto mentioned this at the very end of his presentation, but one of my previous colleagues did her PhD on the tortoise interactions on Round Island, how they've affected the plant community, as well as interactions with other reptiles. She published part of this work in 2021, and she found mixed results on the impacts. Some positives she found was that the tortoises were able to create the open bare ground habitats that slow-growing native species need to be able to compete with non-native flora. She also found, as others have mentioned, that tortoises are great seed dispersers, particularly for native palm species, Latania legisi and Pandanus vandermeeshi, being able to increase their spread around the island and increase natural regeneration rates. However, as highlighted in this paragraph from her paper on the screen, this was not the case for the rarest of the herbaceous species. She found that these were not as prevalent as what original researchers were hoping they would be after a reintroduction. And this was likely because the soil seed bank for these species has been lost, and that tortoises could not recreate something that was no longer there. She found that tortoises were not the panacea that researchers were originally expecting them to be, but tortoises still play an important role in plant restoration on Round in conjunction with additional plant restoration measures. And this was the catalyst for the project I am here to talk about today. Which to start off with, plant restoration efforts on Round Island have for decades mainly been focused on restoring the native forest as described in historical records. Recently, the focus has changed to the understory community. In 2019 and 2020, we looked to start to reintroduce ferns to Round Island with the species Phaematosauris scolopendria, which was last seen on Round Island in the 1950s. This species, however, is still found on mainland Mauritius and the Southeast Islets, and including Îles Aigrettes, where we took individuals from to transplant to Round Island. As Roberto mentioned and others have, giant tortoises have been introduced to this island, and has been observed that for newly planted individuals, there is tortoise grazing on them, as well as this species in particular. So we found that enclosing the fern forest area where we'd be planting was necessary to help them establish. So far, the ferns have been successful in reproducing fronds and starting to develop spores, but there is additional unexpected benefits to excluding tortoises from this area. As you can see in this photo, there's a mat of seedlings of Eugenia lucida that was taken, I took last year in the fern forest. Unfortunately, this level of regeneration is not readily found across Round Island, particularly not in highly grazed tortoise areas. We have observed through monitoring the fern forest area that some management of tortoises around areas of early planted individuals, and for certain species, that management and exclusion of tortoises will be necessary. And I'm sorry. Okay, the second half of our understory restoration focus is for the rare herbaceous species. In the paper that I previously highlighted, she mentioned the tortoise grace community. On Round Island, this has 3 focus species. On the bottom is Aerva conjusta, to the top right is Phyllanthus martianus, and to the top left is Phyllanthus reviani. For populations of Phyllanthus martianus and Phyllanthus reviani continue to naturally regenerate on Round Island, as well as on mainland and some of the southeast islets. However, for Aerva conjusta, the wild population on Round Island has been lost since 2016, with only 1 mainland population left. And thus, under IUCN Red List guidelines, we consider it to be critically endangered. We have attempted to plant individuals of Aerva conjusta on Round Island, as well as Ilzagret. However, unfortunately, all of these have failed. During the COVID-19 pandemic, our staff was evacuated several times for long periods of time, and thus we almost lost all of our backup populations of this species in the plant nursery. This created an incredible need to find a new way to plant these species to increase their survival and success rate. And so with the previous failings of planting out these rare herbaceous species and the findings we had of the fern forest and Rose's paper, we wanted to find a way to create an environment that would ensure their survival long enough that they would start to recreate the soil seed bank that has been lost. And thus this ended up looking like wanting to create shaded, protected plots in some of the higher tortoise active areas, so that once in the future we can re-attract tortoises without much effort. We chose sites in the mixed vegetation community that were not the densest sites, but on the edges, so that they would not be affected by natural regeneration of shrubs, but still close enough that tortoises could move the seeds dropped into this community. We've surveyed other islets that have some of these focused species populations and other important native herbaceous species to look at species composition and interaction so we can better plan planting on Round Island. Once planting has occurred, we will put in place a rigorous management system, including weekly weeding and watering and monthly monitoring of percent cover of these plots. And then in the future, over 3 years of monitoring, managing, and any supplementary planting necessary, we hope that these plots will be established enough that we can start to take back these protections and allow tortoises back into this area to help what we hypothesize be the disturbance mechanism needed to help increase germination and spread of the species on Round Island. And just a map of where the 3 chosen locations are on Round Island. We have 2 sites in the mixed vegetation community, as I mentioned, and then 1 on the southwestern ridge of Round Island that is more of an open grassland community. We have chosen sites that are in active tortoise areas, as I mentioned. There's tortoises in every one of these photos, if you can find them. We've also chosen sites that we have enough soil depth to plant these species and are close enough to the field station and existing irrigation systems to accommodate the amount of effort we will need to take care of these sites. Unfortunately, due to unexpected barriers to bringing materials onto Round Island this year, I don't have constructed plots to show you or initial data, but I do have some interns that have brought the materials to one of the sites that you can look at. As I mentioned, we'll have 3 shaded and fenced plots. 2 will be 9 by 9 meters in the mixed vegetation community, and 1 10 by 10 meters in this open grassland. Materials you hope to be used is shade netting over the entire area, galvanized fencing and rods to prevent tortoises from getting in, and structural supports for cyclones. We're in the process of propagating all the 3 focus species, so hopefully have equal distribution in these plots while also maintaining backup populations in the nursery. We have chosen 7 additional herbaceous and non-hardwood species that are either low numbers on Round Island, or we have seen on other islands to interact with the focus species. So project timeline. What we've completed so far is the initial surveying, the purchasing and moving of materials, and we're in the process of constructing these plots and doing the plant propagation. We hope to do in January 2024 is to start the planting in each of these plots and to start the monitoring and managing process. In the future, if we have seen that the plots have established, we hope to see if they have been successful and publish our results and then replicate the use of these plots elsewhere. So what do we hope to achieve with this project? Well, obviously, primarily we want to reestablish a wild population of Aerba congesta on Round Island and increase the population and range of Phyllanthus marcianus and Phyllanthus raviani on Round Island. But secondarily, we want to see if this planting method is successful and what the species interactions are between the focus species and other native species. But subtly, we also want to look at how managing tortoises affects plant restoration on Round Island, how manipulating known species interactions will or not help us to our goals. On Round Island and Îles aux Grettes as well, there are some herbaceous species that are negatively impacted by some of the tortoise grazing pressure. Well, on the other hand, other species on Round Island need this grazing pressure to be increased to be able to compete with non-native species. How do we strike the balance with this on Round Island so that tortoises can be partners against extinction for species like Aerba congesta rather than aiding in their demise? This is something we're continuing to untangle, and we hope that by implementing this project, we'll have new insights on this. So I want to end on some acknowledgements of our government partners, our important funding support for this project, and our institutional partners. And I want to thank IOTA for inviting me to speak with you today.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. Do we have any questions from the audience right now? Let's have a little look online. Excuse me. Some Q&As. Oh no, that was a previous one from the so when I've got a question. Once the plots are constructed, and this is to keep the tortoises out, and they're going to be very strong fences, I assume. And so I missed, did you say like how long you'll leave?
Yeah, so right now we're hoping to leave them for 3 years, but once we get the 3-year mark, we'll see if, based on our monitoring, if they have been established, if they're continuing to regenerate, or if they are needing to be planted out more.
Okay. Anything further? All right. Thank you very much, Cacey. Thanks for coming as well. Okay. There's Chrissy. Yep. Right. We've got chat as well. Cacey, Cacey, you're not let off the hook. There's a question from Chrissy. Chrissy is curious to know what native species are negatively affected by tortoises, and whether you think this would be different had the native tortoise persisted.
So I guess I would say that I guess not significantly negatively affected. I guess in the way that it would be the intensity of the grazing pressure for certain areas, it wasn't enough to be able to counteract non-native species. In others, the trampling has prevented some of the hardwood species from being able to create those weed mats, as we saw in the fern forest. It just like reduced the prevalence of some hardwood regeneration in the mixed vegetation community, as well as just preference of certain herbaceous species. Or used to be on Round Island, there's probably multiple aspects of why it's been lost, but the tortoises grazing in that area probably didn't do a good enough job to compete with the non-native species that are there. Sorry, was the other part of the question? Obviously, I don't know the ecology of the native tortoise species. Obviously, the species we've introduced have certain characteristics, and the species that we know to be there are a bit smaller than the giant tortoises. So it's hard to know if they would have had specific grazing styles that would have increased these species. I don't know what those would be, but it could definitely be possible.